Have you ever noticed how everything falls into place the moment you stop worrying? It sounds paradoxical, right? All our lives we've been told, set goals, fight, achieve. But what if the truth is the opposite? What if it's our attachments to people, outcomes, expectations that weigh us down in relationships, at work, and even on the journey to inner peace? Carl Jung, the genius of psychology, revealed a disconcerting truth. The more desperately you cling to control, the faster life slips through your fingers. Today we'll explore why the ability to let go might be the only path to true freedom. Stay with us until the end. This simple shift in perception could turn everything upside down. And if you want to dive deeper into your own psyche, don't forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel via the link in the description. We hold tightly to our ideas of how things should be, and in that very moment, life seems to mock us. Everything goes awry. That attachment, which should give stability, often turns into a source of constant anxiety. The trick is, the very moment you unclench your fists, the world breathes a sigh of relief. Jung stated it clearly: chase and it flees, accept and it transforms. We live in a society that teaches perpetual striving. Rest is always over the next horizon. Yet it is our neurotic need to control that hinders real change, not to just fold our hands and drift along, but to subtly shift from constant tension to conscious witnessing. Jung studied the mysteries of the human psyche and discovered this law. While we're obsessed with fantasies, ideal partners, brilliant careers, a perfect future, we cannot see what's actually happening inside us. Of course, desiring success is natural. The trouble begins when our entire identity becomes tied to outcomes. If I am my job, my relationship, or my achievements, any failure feels like a threat to my very existence. Out of this arises endless fear, gnawing anxiety, and a mad attempt to control every aspect of life. Jung called this a futile attempt by the ego to preserve its illusions. True transformation doesn't occur when we hammer ourselves against a wall with all our might. It happens when we finally release resistance to the natural flow of things. Not out of weakness, but from insight. To let go doesn't mean to walk away casually. It means to allow something new to emerge. Something beyond sheer will. A leap of trust in an invisible wisdom guiding the current of our lives. When that shift truly happens, chaos suddenly makes sense. Opportunities arise without exhausting pursuit, and constant anxiety is replaced by a strange feeling, as if you're finally present in your own life. Letting go is not the abandonment of dreams, but the release of the obsessive notion that things must go according to your plan. It's your escape from the prison of "I must" into the spaciousness of awareness. But what if it's not the person we're attached to, but what we've invested in them? Jung was categorical. We almost never cling to another human being. We cling to our projections, our hope that they will give us the validation, the love, the salvation we crave. We cast people in roles they never agreed to play. We project onto others what we don't want to acknowledge in ourselves, idealizing them or demonizing them. And it's in that warped mirror that painful attachment is born. Our ego tries to turn the outer world into an extension of itself, to possess it as a child claims toys. The fear of being unnecessary disguises itself as manic ambition, hunger for success as the painful dependency on love. What we think of as noble striving often turns out to be just a desperate attempt to fill an internal void. But no one can sustain a role forever. When illusions shatter, bitter disappointment remains. Jung saw this as a defense mechanism of the psyche. Far easier to blame others than face the parts of ourselves we've worked so hard to hide. But when we finally recognize our projections, a miracle occurs. Reality begins to shift. The other person ceases to be a screen for our fantasies and becomes simply a human being with strengths and flaws. The process of disentangling from illusions is painful, but it brings incredible relief. It's the beginning of honest relationships, starting with the one with yourself. When you stop chasing what you believe will make you whole, a paradox happens. You find yourself closer to your true self than ever before. Then, with minimal effort, almost magically, things truly start to fall into place. When we stop trying to dominate everything, space opens within us for more conscious presence, In that state, our connection to the world is no longer based on possession, but on genuine closeness. But what happens when our illusions collapse? The ego panics and convulsively clings to what is, by nature, uncontrollable. Here it's crucial to feel the subtle but essential distinction between inner direction and compulsive need to control every step. The first arises from harmony with ourselves. The second from fear masquerading as competence. We make plans, try to forecast every possible scenario as if that could assure our safety. In reality, such hyper-control is simply the ego's attempt to ward off the unavoidable unpredictability of life. Jung said that neurosis is always a substitute for genuine experience. In that sense, control acts as anesthetic. Instead of feeling, we overload the mind with strategies. Instead of meeting our vulnerability, we hide behind routine, goals, and promises as if total surveillance of every facet of existence could spare us pain. To control isn't to live, it's to exist in an artificial capsule where we willingly sacrifice spontaneity for illusory stability. Yet it is spontaneity that gives life its color and authenticity. Without it, relationships turn into mechanical rituals, work into burdensome duty, and even the fullest days lose depth. The bloated ego believes it must and can handle everything. It stubbornly insists there's only one correct way to live, and any deviation from that template triggers guilt, anxiety, and self-criticism. The mind becomes hyperactive, like an overloaded operating system running dozens of programs simultaneously. Mental and emotional exhaustion in such a case isn't weakness, it's the inevitable result of that way of being. Deep down, the controller is a shield against surrender. But to surrender here doesn't mean to give up. It means to acknowledge that there are forces, both within us and in life itself, that resist our will. Jung saw in the unconscious a living, autonomous system actively co-creating our reality. Ignoring that layer traps us in a rational prison, as if all questions can be resolved by logic alone. Letting go of control means making an act of trust, recognizing that even in chaos, wisdom exists, and that in surprises lies the path, not to a life without direction, but to a willingness to let life surprise us. Even in a world where we plan every moment of silence, the harder we push for control, the more we drift from ourselves. Conversely, when we allow ourselves simply to observe, to listen and feel without immediate interference, we begin to notice that life has its own rhythm, and it knows where to lead. What if real freedom doesn't lie in control, but in the ego's willingness to reposition itself? This is the moment when a weary ego finally loosens its grasp and turns towards something deeper, the self. This is the center of our psyche, the wholeness of being, not a social mask or a role we play, but who we are when we stop pretending. From grief to new life. Our inner voice no longer operates on logic alone, but in that non-linear place, what we once thought unattainable begins to find us. Sometimes what doesn't unfold is exactly what leads us inward, to reevaluate our values, to reestablish foundations, to let go of old plans that no longer belong to us, even if they still look familiar. Respecting grief is just as important as letting go, because only by walking through pain, without denying its presence, can we truly transform. We shouldn't cling to suffering, but ignoring it also fails us. Conscious grief has its time, and in that time, something matures. Letting go is also a lesson in honoring invisible losses, the wounds that leave no visible scar but cut deep into the soul. In that unnoticed wound, new life gradually begins, not as promise, but as possibility. When that which tied us finally dissolves, something fascinating happens. The world does not end. On the contrary, it begins to reorganize. Silence, once feared, becomes fertile. The emptiness that terrified becomes space. In that space, new seeds begin to sprout. Things that couldn't have been born when everything was occupied by control, expectation, and noise. It's like opening a window after years of closeness. Dust dances in the light. The air shifts. At first it's strange, uncomfortable serenity, but in time breath returns, and with it, presence. The mind stops chasing and begins to listen, to the body, to time, to subtle sensations. Imagine someone who spent years in a relationship with no real exchange, just fear, attachment, or habit. One day they let go, not only of the person, but of illusions about how everything should continue. Silence arrives, emptiness follows, but soon space emerges. In that space, they return to creativity, to writing, to cooking, to a walk, to listening to music in the dark. That is a return, not to a task, but to the expression of self. Jung said that psychic energy restores itself when we stop feeding the ego. Everything we once invested in maintaining mass, controlling the future, resisting the present becomes available. That energy must go somewhere, and it is precisely then that creativity is born. Not only artistic creation, but existential creation. Not just painting or poetry, but a reorganization of life itself. A change in habitual rhythm, the transformation of suffering into practical wisdom. Creativity begins where reactivity ends, and conscious choice begins. It happens only when space appears. In that space, intuition speaks louder. What was once suppressed by fear now sounds clearer. You begin to see connections where you previously saw only problems. Ideas arrive spontaneously. Answers come without effort. You stop thinking to find and start feeling to see. Time changes too. Days no longer feel like battlefields. You slow down, not from laziness, but from inner alignment. Decisions become easier because you're no longer trying to prove anything. And strangely, what once seemed out of reach starts to come to you. Not by magic, but because you stopped obstructing the flow. Picture an artist blocked, demanding genius from themselves yet unable to create. One day exhausted, they let go of the project. They allow themselves to rest. They walk into the void, and there, unexpectedly, a new, alive idea emerges. That is the power of letting go. When you release what is no longer true, space opens for birth. This state of free creativity and connection with the self stands in opposition to the logic of the ego. The ego strives for control and guarantees, whereas the self seeks expression of truth and harmony. When the ego steps aside, the self takes the lead, with ease. It doesn't force, it reveals through what brings you joy, even if unseen and unproductive. In these moments, letting go shows its most beautiful face. It is not just loss, but transition, a bridge between who you were when trying to prove something and who you are when it's enough to simply be. Letting go returns you to yourself without excess, without noise, without burdens that no longer belong to you. The space that opens after letting go is not emptiness to fear. It's fertile soil awaiting your true presence. Life doesn't shout, it whispers. You become more attentive, cleansed from within, and begin to listen. Ultimately, it all comes down to one quiet gesture, an open hand, letting go of expectations, fears, and repetitive stories. This isn't from fatigue, though sometimes fatigue is what initiates it, but from clarity, when holding tight costs more than the loss itself. Attachment, even when it feels familiar, is not love. It is born from fear of lack and attempts to hold something alive that may already have served its purpose. To love is to let another be, even when life's flow contradicts our expectations. Control is not strength, it's resistance masquerading as it. A life built on that logic, a life in constant tension with the present, no soul can endure that too long. Jung knew that healing when masks fall, but masks and dependencies exact a cost. They drain us of energy. There comes a moment when holding everything together simply fails. The image we constructed to meet expectations begins to crumble. The strength that once felt like control becomes a burden. The exhaustion that seems physical reveals that the ego is worn thin, not from laziness or weakness, but as a silent cry from the unconscious. I cannot keep pretending. And it's then that the true self begins to emerge. Not with fanfare, but with a quiet calm that settles in when something finally ends. Jung saw such crises as calls to truth, when inner chaos is actually a signal that reorganization at a deeper level is underway. Today's emotional burnout isn't just overstimulation, it's having too many roles, too many expectations, and too little accord with what we actually feel. A life dependent on maintaining an image consumes constant energy. You must weigh words, emotions, reactions, always be in control. But when your body begins to falter, the mind overloads and willpower disappears, you sense something needs attention. Who are you without all of that? In that moment, letting go becomes a real alternative, not escape, but liberation. Then you realize you no longer need to force anything. You don't need to prove your value. You can pause and yet remain. In fact, you begin to emerge more authentically. The ego resists, afraid that without effort, everything will collapse. But surrender is not defeat. It is psychological wisdom. It is acknowledging that there are limits, and forcing them only leads to emptiness. Jung knew that an ignored psyche creates symptoms, but if we listen, it opens a path. Exhaustion from the mask is an invitation to pause. Ask, what truly matters? Acknowledge that sometimes you simply need rest. Drop the burden of pretense. In that pause, something genuine can arise. When the mask falls away, what remains is pain, rarely discussed, the grief of becoming someone we never were. People speak about letting go as freedom, but rarely about the pain that comes with it. Letting go is also a kind of death, not physical, but symbolic, sometimes just as intense. Letting go of ideas, of relationships, of projected futures. This grieving is essential. Jung understood suffering not as an error to be eliminated, but as a necessary process for transformation. Without death, no rebirth, externally or internally. When something must be released, whether it's a plan that failed, love that didn't last, identity that no longer serves, that loss, even if necessary, carries pain. In this context, letting go is not a rational decision. It is a deep emotional process. It often leads us to places of quiet, doubt, and vulnerability. The emptiness that arises when what we anchored on disappears can be terrifying, but it can also be fertile. In that space appear tangled feelings, relief and sadness, freedom and solitude, courage and fear. It's all part of the grief, not only of what was lost, but of the story we once told ourselves about how things should be. For so long, when the ego has been steering the ship, life organizes itself around external expectations. How I must behave, look, what the world expects of me. Letting go of these imposed ideas is the beginning, not a return to the past, but a movement toward the core. Jung called this process individuation, becoming who we truly are by integrating conscious and unconscious parts of ourselves. That journey starts with small breakthroughs. You stop reacting by old patterns, realize you no longer have to uphold certain roles, and after a breakup, don't rush to fill the void, but instead sit with it. These moments of letting go become portals, not offering instant comfort, but opening a space for authenticity. True surrender begins when the ego acknowledges its limits, when it learns it doesn't need to control everything and answer all questions. That's when something quiet awakens within. We call it the self. It doesn't impose, it doesn't shout, it guides with clear simplicity. Its promptings come not from logic, but from inner resonance, something meaningful, even if we can't articulate it immediately. This kind of letting go is far from passivity. It's a more refined form of presence, acting without obsession over outcomes, loving without demanding reciprocity, creating without needing validation. In that state, the driving force becomes an inner integrity that needs no applause to simply be. In the process of individuation, the ego doesn't disappear, it changes its position. Instead of claiming absolute truth, it begins serving the self. This inner transformation changes everything. Relationships become more authentic, choices more meaningful, and life, once seemed like a conquest, unfolds like an experience worth living. Letting go here isn't loss, it's integration. It's allowing what must depart to leave and welcoming what's ready to emerge. In this gesture, we stop existing as a collection of roles and begin living as whole beings. But for the self to emerge, we must first contend with another protector, the persona. One of Jung's key concepts, the persona, is the social mask we wear to be accepted. It is necessary. We exist in society. But the problem arises when we identify too strongly with it and live for our image. Strong, spiritual, successful, ideal. Although these labels may sound noble, they come with a tremendous cost. Constant vigilance, exhaustion from performance, and worst of all, alienation from ourselves. It's impossible to be whole when most of our energy is devoted to upholding an image. Jung described the persona as a necessary but limited tool, a bridge between inner and outer worlds. The problem begins when we forget there's something greater behind it. When attachment to a persona becomes so strong, any threat to it triggers fear, anger, defensive reactions. In that moment, we're not living. We're managing impressions. Liberation starts when we realize we no longer need to sustain a fixed story about who we are. We can make mistakes, change opinions, be contradictory. We don't have to remain consistent with who we were yesterday. We only need to be honest about what we feel now. From that place arises authenticity, even if it offends some. Letting go of the persona is a radical act. It takes courage to show yourself unprotected, to allow yourself to be seen, even if it shatters an image you've built over years. But that gesture liberates. It's like stepping off a poorly performed stage and finally inhaling deeply, becoming the author of your own words. Jung put it precisely, "He who looks outside dreams, he who looks inside awakens." Attachment to image is a form of lucid sleep, the belief that we are merely what we show. Awakening begins when we acknowledge the complexity that the persona cannot contain. In that recognition, real life begins. Freedom can be frightening. Though many of us crave it, few are willing to confront it honestly. To be free means having no refuge in people, roles, or promises. It means taking responsibility for even those parts of ourselves we'd rather not face. And it is precisely there that Jung said the shadow resides. The shadow, according to Jung, is the unconscious part of our psyche. These are the aspects we reject or ignore, not necessarily because they are bad, but because they did not fit into our idealized self-image. And the more we deny these parts of ourselves, the more power they gain. Often, people who say they want freedom are afraid of what might come with it: emptiness, silence, the loss of support. So they cling to another person, to their job, to an idealized future, not out of love, but out of fear of what will happen when everything they counted on collapses. Letting go is not only about releasing the external, it's about turning inward. What remains when desire fails to be fulfilled? What happens when a relationship ends or plans fall apart? In that empty space, the shadow appears, and it doesn't always come gently. It can show up as anger, envy, or